10 days after I spoke thus with Uldra, I was at Berkeley with Wulfnoth and Godwine. That was in the 3rd week in June, while I was on my honor not to fight for a month yet. I had parted from Uldra as from a dear friend and no more, though well I knew now that she was more than that to me. And there had been a look in her face, moreover, that bided with me, making me wretched and yet glad, for it told me that her thoughts were as mine. And more than that neither of us would show. The tide of war had hold of me, and whither it would drift me none could say. Nor did I lose much. I had not to lose as it seemed to me. As for the rest of those who were such good friends of mine at Penhost, they had wished me hearty Godspeeds, bidding me return again, and that soon. Eldred of Dollington and Sexburga stood hand in hand as I went, vowing that they would not be content till I returned for their wedding, for there was no trouble between them since the young Thane had come in from his place one day as if naught had happened, calling me to walk with him when Sexburga had feigned to wish for none of his company. After which he had talked lightly of going to Wessex with the Earl and me, and he had no further trouble. I know not what he said presently in private to Sexburga, but he was the one who led thereafter, and I think that the maiden was the happier that it was so. There are some maids who will seem to wish to rule, though they are longing all the while to be ruled. So we came up the Severn River to Berkeley, passing the endless lines of Danish ships that lay along the strand below Anst Cliffs and Oldbury. Knut's ship guard held the ancient fort in force, men said. His men boarded us, but Wulfnoth's name was well known, and it was not Knut's plan to make an enemy of him. So we went on our way unhindered, and I abided, chafing sorely, in the great house where Wulfnoth lived in no state at all, as if he were but a rich franklin grey-clad and rough in ways and talk. Now it is hard to me to think of what passed so close to me while I was helpless. But I saw not of the battle that was at Penselwood, and even as I heard thereof from men who had left the levy, the greatest battle of all was being fought within a morning's ride of us, at Shurston. 2 days that battle raged, and all men say that Edmund would surely have chased the Danes in the end to their ships, but for a trick of Edric Streon's. It was another count in the long score against him, and I seemed to see that the words of the Witch of Senlac were coming true. His shadow was over our king, for ill in all things. The battle was going against Knut once Edmund himself had cut his way through the press of Danes before their king, and had almost come to hand strokes with him, but had been borne back. And then Streon's eyes lit on one Osmer, a warrior of the Danish host, standing near him, and he saw that he was like our king. Therefore he slew him, and set his head on a spear, and rode forward to where the English line pressed most hardly on the Danish ranks. There he raised the head aloft, shouting in his great voice, "Fly, English, fly! Edmund is dead. Know his head." Then for a moment panic seized our folk, and they held their hands, and in that pause Ulf the Jarl charged among them, and the line was broken and flight began. But Edmund unhelmed when he heard the cry that he was slain, and rode through the ranks, and our men knew him, and cheered, and fell on the Danes afresh, and the broken line closed up, and they fought till night fell, and in the night the Danes drew off. And in the night by twos and threes, and then in companies, Edmund's levies melted away from him, for his men were worn out and sick of slaughter, and knew not enough to bid them stay to follow their foes and turn retreat into rout, and doubt into victory. The Danes were going, they saw and heard, what need to stay longer? So it came to pass that nothing was wrought by that awful fighting, and both sides claimed victory, for our men deemed that they had won, and the Danes claimed it because they were not followed, and because Ulf the Jarl had cut through our line. It was through this last that I lost Godwine as a companion. For Ulf lost himself in the forest that was in the rear of our forces, because he followed the flying too far, and the dusk of the evening was close at hand. He thought that the victory was surely won, for it had ever been that the first sign of flight was followed by rout of our men. At least the Danes learnt this at Shurston, that Edmund could hold his own against them. So Ulf the Jarl wandered all night in the wood, and came out of it on the hillside where Godwine was speaking to one of his father's shepherds. And Godwine brought him, unknowing who he was, back to Berkeley. Then maybe came into Wulfnutha's mind that rede of the witch of Senlac, that bade Godwine mind his sheep, and so find his place, or else this was part of the plan which had brought him into Wessex. For he asked Ulf to take Godwine to Nut, and find him a place in his court, and the Jarl did so. It was not until Godwine came to the ships that he knew who it was that he had guided, and they won him over, and he stayed. Nor did I know. I spoke with Ulf, asking him of the battle, and of Egil, and the like, for he was the Earl's guest. And I thought nothing of Godwine's guidance of a Dane to the ships, for the Earl was no foe of Nut. But when I rose in the morning after Ulf had come, and found that he and Godwine had gone in the night, and was told by Wulfnoth who the warrior was, and what he had asked for his son, I was very angry, though I knew that the Earl had little cause to love the house of Ethelred. But the Earl said, very quietly, "There are 2 kings in England, and no king of England. Choice is free to me, and I choose that king who will honor my son, and who has done me no wrong. Were you to go to Nut, I would hold you blameworthy, seeing how things have been between you and Edmund. Godwine goes to Nut even as he flies to his ships. No man may say that he did but join him when he was victor." Now, it was not Wulfnutha's way to give reasons thus for aught that he did, and I was surprised that he would do so to me. But I could look at things in his way if I put my own love for Edmund aside, and I said, "I may not blame you, Lord Earl, maybe, but it is hard for me to see my friend take what I think the wrong side. Think no ill of him." "It is my doing," Wulfnoth said. "All his life has Godwine been bidden to hate the house of Ethelred of Wessex. Now before long this warfare must end. And if your king has the victory, I pray you speak for Godwine if need is. And if Nut is victor, you will need Godwine, maybe, to speak for you. Let this matter bide there between us. I would now that I had not let him go, for I am lonely." Then I knew why the fierce old Earl unbent to speak thus to me, and I spoke only of honor to be gained in the service of so great a king as Nut. Thereafter the time went very heavily for me. The great Danish fleet left the Severn on the day when Godwine would have come to them, and then Edmund must gather another levy, and prepare for some fresh landing. And before that was done I was free again, and I could join him with a light heart. The Earl gave me a good horse when I rode away, and parted with me very kindly for Godwine's sake, he said, and his own liking for me also. "I shall look for you at Pevensey yet. Come to me when things go ill with you, and you shall be welcome." I knew not if ever I should see Sussex again. But of this I was sure now, that if fortune went with me presently, I would surely seek Aylwin and tell him that I must be free, and so would seek Uldra, and ask her to share what I might have to give her, if a home should be mine again. I had thought much of this brave, quiet maiden while I was chafing at doing naught in Wulfnutha's farmstead, though I would not have stayed at Penhost. Now came a time when the victory was ours, and it seemed that at last the strong hand had come. For men would follow Edmund, and he had the power of making them fight as he would. Yet there was nothing that would keep our levies together. Had they done so we had surely conquered, but it was ever the same. They fought and dispersed, and all the work and loss was for naught. I think it would have been the same with the Danish host had they been in their own country, but here they must needs hold together, and Nut and his jarls wielded that mighty force as a man wields his sword. Edmund smote as a man who fells his enemy with a staff that breaks in the smiting, so that he must needs seek another while his fallen foe rises again, sword in hand. But our men were called from home and fireside to fight, and when they won in their own fields and houses were safe, they thought they had done all, and went home again, at ease, and maybe boasting overmuch. We marched on London and relieved the city, driving the Danes in flight to their ships. And Edmund slept that night among a great host, and in the morning the Wessex men were going home, and only his own housecarls and the men who followed him from ruined Mercia and East Anglia and Kent would bide around him. London could take care of herself now. But Edmund strove to gather them for one more blow, and we had a great fight at Brentford, for the Danes had gone up river, and we won. Yet the Danes turned on us when the ships were reached, and we lost many men in the river, for they scattered in their eagerness to plunder the ships that they thought were already won, and so, without order or leaders, were driven to their death in the swift water. Then Wessex disbanded, and all the work of gathering our forces must be done over again, and at once the Danes closed in round London when Edmund had gone back to Salisbury. Surely it would have broken the heart of any man but Edmund the Ironside that thus it must be, but he would say, "England is waking, we shall win yet." Then Nut recalled the ships and host from London, and they raised the siege, and went into the Orwell, and once again began to march across the heart of our land. This fourth levy that Edmund the king had made was the best that he had had. And word must have come thereof to the Danes, for they went back to their fleet, and so waited for a little while, thinking doubtless that this levy would melt away in idleness as ever. For they came back into the Medway with the booty they had, and there we fell on them and drove them headlong to their ships, and I surely thought that we had done with Nut for good and all. Then fell the shadow of ill on us. Edric Streon and his men met us at Aylesford, and he came in to the king and made most humble submission to him. And that was what Olaf had told Edmund would happen when once again he had the victory. Therefore when I saw the earl come into the camp to speak with Edmund I said, "Mind you what Olaf said? How that you should hang Streon." "I mind it. But the man is deserted by his new friends. They have gone." Almost had Edmund quarrelled with Olaf on that saying. "Put him in ward, my king, at least," I urged, and Ulfketel, who had come with us from London, prayed him also to do so. But Edmund's fate was on him, and he received his foster father kindly, and forgave him, and thought that all would be well. Now with Ulfketel came my Colchester men, or rather the 30 who were left, and those 2 brothers, Thrand and Guthorm, who had ridden to Stamford with me were there also. These 2 came to me that evening when I was alone, and said that they had a plan they would carry out if I gave the word. And it was nothing more or less than that they would fall on Edric Streon and slay him when and where they met him. I would that they had not asked me, but had wrought the deed on their own account. But I said that I could not have this done, for it was too much after Streon's own manner of settling things. I could not think of letting my men lie in wait for any foe of mine, however good cause I had for hating him. And I did hate Streon with a hate that I am not ashamed of, not for my own sake, but because he was a traitor to both king and country. There were Englishmen who fought for Nut thinking that thus they wrought best for England and her peace as Wulfnoth chose for Godwine, and I had no hatred for them. They were honest if they were wrong, but they were no traitors. But Edric Streon was as Judas to me. So Thrand and Guthorm grumbled, and forbore, though they would have spent their own lives willingly in this way had I lifted a finger. It was, however, in revenge for the Stamford business that they would slay the earl, and that was only my quarrel, nothing higher. Nevertheless I owed them thanks for their love thus shown to me, and so I told them. Little had I done to deserve it, but who shall know what wins the love of rough souls like these? Strange news came with Streon, though I had heard rumors thereof before, as I have said. It was true that Nut was to wed Emma the Queen, and they had, as it seemed, already been betrothed, at the advice of the 3 great Jarls. Now she and the Athelings her sons were back in Normandy, and one might see what the reason of this policy was. Not only was Duke Richard kept quiet, but also Nut was stepfather to Edward Atheling and his brothers. That meant that if Nut won, they must needs suffer him to take the crown unopposed. And more than this, if Nut must leave England alone presently, when Edmund died he would claim the throne at once, either for himself or for one of these Athelings as his under-king. For no man ever thought twice of Edmund's brother Edwy, who was weak bodily, nor of his half-brother, the other Edwy, whom we called King of the Churls, by reason of the low birth of his mother, for no thanes would follow him had he had the gift of leading. Nut's fleet went from the Medway northward, and it was in the thoughts of all men that the end had come, and that he sought his own land at last. And that seemed the more certain to most because Strione had submitted, as if he knew that he had no further hope of honor from the Danish king. Presently, however, it was plain that his coming over was but part of the deepest plot that he had yet made. Suddenly, even as our levies dispersed in spite of all the king's entreaties, came the news that the Danish fleet had turned and was in the Crouch River in Essex, whence already the host had begun their march inland across Mercia in the old way. And so for the 5th time Edmund strove to gather all England to him, and his summons was well obeyed. The thanes and their men gathered in haste, savage with hope deferred, and Nut shrank back again to Ashington on the Crouch, and there built himself an earthwork on the south side of the river, while his ships lay on the further shore at Burnham, and in the anchorage, and along the mud below the earthworks, seeming countless. And there he waited for us, and there we knew that he meant to end the warfare in one great fight for mastery, with his ships behind him that he might go if he were at last obliged. And there, too, though we knew it not, he waited for Strione to give England into his hands. We were close on him when his main force fell back upon his earthworks, where they stand on the little hill above the river banks that men will call Nuts Dune, 13, henceforward, in memory of what he won there. And Ulfketel and I and the few East Anglians that we had were with the advance guard, and drove in the pickets that were between us and the hill. And then we knew that Nut meant to stand and fight in the open, and we were glad, for out of his entrenchments poured his men, and we sent horsemen back to Edmund to hurry on the main body of our forces. They were a mile or two behind us, and we waited impatiently, watching the Danish host as it neared us, forming into the terrible half-circle as it came. And I remember all of that waiting, for the day began with such hope, and ended so fearfully for us. One could not have had a better day on which to fight, for there was neither sun to dazzle, nor rain to beat in the faces of men who needed eyes to guard their lives. But it was a grey day with a pleasant wind that blew in from the sea, and the light was wonderfully clear and shadowless as before rain, so that one could see all things over plainly, as it were. The rounded top of Ashington Hill seemed to tower higher than its wont, and close at hand, beyond the swampy meadows to our left, and I wondered that Nut had not chosen that for his camping ground, though maybe it would have been less well placed for reaching the ships, owing to some shoaling of water that did not suit them. The tide was nearly high now, and all the wide stretch of the Crouch River was alive with the ships that brought over men from the Burnham shore, and one could see the very wake and the ripple at the bows as they came. And when one looked at the Danes, the chiefs who ordered the host were plain to be seen, and the gay colors of banners and cloaks and shields were wonderful in the brightness, though at first we were nearly half a mile from them as we waited. I thought that we were about equal to them in numbers, and I knew that did we but fight as at Schurston the day would surely be ours. For when a force that is hard-pressed knows that safety is close behind them, there is an ever-present reason for giving way. "We can drive this host to the ships, Lord Earl," I said to Ulfketel. "Aye, surely," he answered. "They know that the ships wait for them, and so will give back." Now came Edmund, and behind him our men marched steadily, and at his side was Edric Strione. He looked at the Danes, and his face was bright and confident. "How shall we fight, Lord Earl?" he said to Ulfketel. "Redwald and I have spoken thereof," the Earl answered. "And it seems to us that Olaf's Viking plan is best. Let us fight in a wedge, and drive the point through that circle and break it in twain. We of East Anglia will willingly make the point, as we are on our own ground." "It is a good plan, but I have not tried it," said Edmund, and then Strione spoke. "The old Saxon line is surely good enough," he said. "What need to take up with outland plans?" "It will be good enough if our men fight as at Schurston," Edmund answered. And all the thanes who were gathering round him cried out that they would surely not fail him, and one could not but listen to the voice of all the noblest in England who were gathered there, for Edmund had all his best with him. It was indeed a levy of all England. So we were to fight in line, as Edmund had given us our places on the day before, when we neared the battlefield. He himself was in the centre with his Wessex men, and Edric Strione and his Mercians were with him. There were some of us who had cried out at that, but the Earl had said proudly that he would make amends for former ill, and the council had listened to and believed his words. Ulfketel was on the left, and there our line was flanked by the marshes that lie between the long slope where we were to fight and Ashington Hill. At least he would have no horsemen upon him from the side, and that flank was safe from turning. The right wing was given to the Lindsey men under their own alderman, and with them were the men of the 5 boroughs, 14. So our line was drawn up, and Edmund rode out before them and they cheered, and then he unhelmed, and Bishop Ednoth of Dorchester, clad in his robes over chain mail, and with a heavy mace at his saddle bow, rode up beside him, and a monk who was with him brought forward and raised aloft a golden cross, and at that sign the host knelt, and the bishop shrived them and blessed them before the fight, and the sound of the amen they spoke was like a thunder roll from end to end of the line. And it reached the ears of the Danes who waited for us, and they broke out into their war song the Heise, and thereat our men sprang up and shouted thrice, and then the sullen silence of the Saxon kin settled down on them, for we are not wont to speak much when work is meant. Silently we crossed the heath between us and the yelling Danes, and I rode beside Edmund in my old place, and my heart was light, and Swordfoe's bane rattled in the scabbard as if longing to be let loose. And all the while I kept my eyes on Streon, who was riding among his Mercians 20 yards away to our right, and presently behind him I saw Thran and Guthorm. I thought that was ill for Streon, but I could not help it now we were but 100 yards from the foe. The first arrow flight crossed as I saw them, and then Edmund cried, "Forward, remember Shurston!" At that word the front ranks sprang like wolves to meet one another, and then came the shock of the meeting lines and the howl and cheer of Dane and Englishman, and under the arrow storm the spear and axe and sword were at work. I kept my shield up and covering Edmund's right side, and watched. The time for us to take our part had not come yet. And Edmund looked on his foes to see what chance might be for a charge that would break them when arms grew weary. Many were the brave deeds that I saw done in that little time, as the first lines fought man to man. And presently I knew that over against us was not the king, for I saw one who was little more than a boy, whose helm bore a golden crown. There were several chiefs round him also, and one was Ulf. But I saw not Godwine, for he would not fight on that day against his own kin. There, too, was another chief, he was Eirik the Jarl, though I knew it not then, and he looked ever to our right, as if waiting for somewhat. And when I saw that I looked also, but there was naught that I could see. Our whole line was fighting well, and this first attack had brought no faltering on either side. Then said Edmund to me, "Let us make a dash for my stepfather yonder," pointing to Nut, and even as he said it the brave bishop on his left threw up his arms and fell from his horse, smitten in the face with a javelin, and Edmund leapt down to help him. As he did so I heard a shout raised that he was slain. Then was a roar from our right like nothing that I had ever heard. I pray that none may ever hear the like again, and I turned and looked to see what was on hand, and I saw the Mercians going backward, and Streon's horse was heading away from the Danes, and then the men of the 5 boroughs howled and fell on Dane and Mercian alike, cursing and smiting like madmen. And I saw my 2 men leap up among the press and smite over the heads of those around them at Streon, and they were smitten down, they had not touched him. That was all in a moment, and I called to the king, and he rose up and leapt on his horse and looked. And as he did so the Mercians, Streon's men, wheeled round and fell on our flank, fighting for the Danes, and the Danish line swept the Stamford men from before them and joined the Mercians, and I heard a great sob rise in Edmund's throat, and he called to me, and charged among the traitors' men to reach him if he might. And the Mercians broke and fled before us, and the Danish line unbroken rolled forward and swept us into flight, for our men knew not what they could do. Then I pointed to Ashington Hill and cried, "We can rally yonder." And Edmund gainsaid me not, but groaned, and called to his men, and we got together and faced round, so that the Danes drew back a little, as men will when a boar turns to bay. And we fought to reach the Lindsey and Borough men through the Danes, who had filled the gap that the flight of the Mercians had made and won to them. There was the greatest slaughter of the Danish host at that time. But we could not win to Ulfketel, for the center and left wing of the Danes lapped us round, and their right drove him back on the marshes, away from us. Then we were pressed back along the higher ground, and we were forced into a great ring that the Danes could not break, and ever where sign of weakening was Edmund rode and shouted and smote, and the Danes gave back before him. Once or twice I could hold my hand as he sat in the midst of our circle watching all that went on, and I saw many things in those few moments while sword foes bane rested. The Mercians had not followed us for very shame, but they sat on the open hillside in the place where the Danish line had been. I think it was not Streon's fault that they were not fighting hand to hand with us. I saw him ride to Ulf the Jarl, and I saw Ulf turn his shoulder on him, and then he sought Rink, and that chief spoke but a word to him, so that he tried not to reach Nut, who never looked at him. Then I saw Ulfketel's men breaking and taking to the marshes, where the Danes cared not to follow them. More than one I could see sinking under the weight of arms in the fen slime among the green tussocks of grass that he had slipped from, and I saw that the flying men made for Ashington Hill. Now as we drew back some word went round among the Danish host and their onset slackened, and presently they drew off and left us to retreat as we would. They could not break our ring, and we were coming to broken land where we might have some advantage. Then Edmund said, "We will go to yonder hill and hold it. Then will East Anglia come to us, and we can begin again tomorrow, maybe, and if not, we can watch the Danes away. All is not lost yet." So we went to Ashington Hill, and there formed up. Only the Danish horsemen followed us to find out what we did. And we saw the main force drawing back towards their earthworks on one wing, while the other held the place of battle, and it was not plain at once why they thus divided. We rested for a short half-hour on Ashington Hill, and the men of Ulfketel gathered to us. But the brave earl was slain, and with him Abbot Wolsey, and the Mercians had slain the alderman of Lindsey when they turned on us, and many more lay in the place where the flight began, good men and noble sold to their deaths by the traitor. It was about midday when we went back to the hill, and the battle, from the time when we had first met, had lasted but a short time. Yet what with slaughter when we broke, and the desertion of the Mercians, we were short of a full third of our men now. Edmund waxed restless. There was the best half of a long summer day before us, and our men were angry and full of longing to fight and take revenge. I think there was not one that did not know all that might hang on this battle. "Redwald," the king said, "is there no way by which we might cross the river? Then might we fall on the ships at Burnham, and Nut must send his men over ship by ship, and so we might well gain the victory." I looked at the tide, and called for some Essex men who knew the place, and one came and told me that in 2 hours' time we might cross at a ford higher up, which they name Hull Bridge, though there is no bridge there. And when he heard that, at once our king set his men in order and cheered them with fresh hopes, and we started to march thither. And at the same time Nut's ships began to move, and from Burnham and from this shore his men were coming up on the tide towards the very place where we would cross, and before the ford could be passed by us we knew that they would be there in force. "So," said Edmund quietly, "they are before us. We will even go back to the hill." We went back, and then I think that we knew the worst. We were hemmed in upon it, for the half of the Danish force that had remained were barring our way inland, while from the river every other man of the Danish host was coming up to attack us from that side. "Now it would seem that some of us will stay on this hill for good," said Edmund, "but if we must lie here till the last day it is a place whence one can look out over the English land and sea and river for which we have died." And so he drew us up in the ring again there on the hilltop, which was wide enough, and we sat down and waited for the coming of the Danes. "Lord King," I said, "let us make a wedge and cut through the Danes inland. So shall we win back to the open country, and we can gather men afresh." He smiled wearily at me, and it seemed to me that at last he had given up hope. And but for Streon's treachery that thing would never have been. It had broken our king's spirit. "Friend," he said, "I will die here if I can." "That shall not be while there is one to give his life for you," I answered, and the thanes around us murmured aye, in that stern voice that means more than aught of clamour. Then I saw some Wessex thanes speaking earnestly to one another, and presently they beckoned to me, and while Edmund sat silent on his horse I went to them to hear what they would. "We will get the king off this field if we can," they said. "We cannot lose him. If chances, we will take him against his will. Hinder us not." "That is well," said I will help you, for he is the hope of England." Maybe Ashington Hilltop is full 50 acres in the more level summit, and we could not guard it all, so we waited on that edge nearest the Danes, the half-circle that faces inland from the marshes towards the battleground we had lost, and to Hockley from the river. And presently the Danes began to come up the hill in even line, and we watched them drawing nearer in silence. Then Edmund bade our bowmen get to work, but the arrows were as not against the long line that did but quicken its advance as they felt their sting here and there. The Danes spread out along the hillside to surround us, and then when they had gained the summit they charged on us, and again we were hand to hand with them. I suppose we fought so, without stirring from the place where we were, for half an hour. Our circle thinned, but never broke, and Dane after Dane fell or drew back to let fresh men come forward, and as we might we also sent fresh men from our inner ranks to relieve those who had grown weary. It was stern hand-to-hand fighting, and one knows how that will ever be. One of two men must go down or give way, and our men fell, but give way they would not. I have said we were on the edge of the hilltop circle, and therefore the attack from the steep hill slope was weakest. And so it came to pass that presently the line against us there was thinned out, because men pressed upwards to the level, and then those Wessex thanes saw that we might break through and cut our way down the hill and make good our retreat. Where Edmund was I followed, and I know that I saved him once or twice from spear thrusts that would have slain him when he charged among the Danes, where they pressed us most hardly. Wearied was my arm, but sword foes bane bit through helm and harness, and once I was facing Ulf the Jarl, and he cried out to me, "Well smitten, Wulfnatha's man." For he knew me. And I looked for Egil, that I might call him to come and win the sword from me, but I could not see him, and a foolish fear that some other than he might get the good blade got hold of me, for I had no doubt that I must fall, and no fear thereof, save that. And why I longed for Egil thus was, I think, because of utter weariness and loss of hope. Then they pushed us as it were over the hill edge, and we began to go down, and I knew at once what would come next. The line of Danes on the hill slope gave way before us and left the way clear, and at first we went slowly and in good order, and then they charged on us down the hill with crushing weight of numbers. And so we fled. I saw the Wessex thanes catch Edmund's bridle, and they turned his horse and spoke to him. And he threatened them with his sword for a moment, but they were urgent, and at last he fled. And I, knowing that if we could keep back the Danes but for a few minutes longer he might escape, cried to what chiefs were left to us, and we rallied on the hillside for a last stand. Then my horse reared and fell back on me, and I heard a great shout, and the rush of many feet passed over me, and Ashington fight and aught else was lost in blackness.